Welcome to the AgCulture Podcast. Today's interview is with Daniel Carson from New Zealand, who is the founder of Ocean Foods, which is a red meat industry company. And really excited to have you here today, Daniel.
Kia ora, thanks for having me.
So we're gonna spend a bit of time talking about the company you founded and the reason you've started it and the challenge that you saw in an industry in New Zealand that's one of the largest industries. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear a little bit about what drew you to agriculture and to the point that you're at today to start a company.
Well, my introduction to agriculture was a lot later in life than most. Wasn't brought up on a farm. Actually went to university, did management and finance, and then from that got into, technology sales. I was one of the first employees for Apple in New Zealand when they started going a bit wider into big box retail stores, with the iPods. That probably shows my age a little bit now. And the technology around that. And then I used to manage the sort of South Island for them, and then got married. And then I actually ended up getting married into a reasonably well-known farming family that was in agribusiness, but didn't actually own any land. And I was given the opportunity to let's go farming. So we started pretty much from a zero base. It was all management through measurement. So adopting obviously my sort of understanding of technology on how to sort of learn quickly. And we started off doing bull beef, which if listeners aren't familiar, in New Zealand there's a big dairy industry. And therefore we have a lot of non-replacement calves, so that don't go into the herd as milking cows. And there's a massive opportunity to grow them out in New Zealand, essentially for a manufacturing ingredient for large corporates as a lean sort of manufacturing protein. So that's what we did. And through that, I obviously sort of developed a passion for those animals, but also understood where there was a massive opportunity to improve the production systems, integrate some data into that supply chain in order to actually meet the needs of the buyers with a bit more detail, especially around the emissions reductions and that type of thing. So that's sort of where I started. Unfortunately, marriage ended, and then the farming career sort of came to a grinding halt, and then decided to sort of try and implement everything I'd learned, and also around the supply chain integration with technology, and then the storytelling for consumers, and also the nutrition that I knew red meat could offer, if sort of built around the right sort of products.
Okay, that's a good overview to get started. And through that, you saw a challenge in the dairy industry, and that pertained to what you knew and had been doing in the past, which was red meat. And if you could describe to the listeners, those that are outside New Zealand, what that challenge in the dairy industry that it's had for eons in New Zealand, especially, and what you wanted to do to solve that problem.
So in New Zealand, we have a very large dairy industry, and it grew reasonably rapidly with export and milk powder and all that sort of carry on. And because it grew rapidly, and because we have such a small sort of internal population, every cow, in order to produce milk, as you know, has to have a calf every year. And those calves, unfortunately, in New Zealand, don't have anywhere to go. So in New Zealand, they're called a bobby calf or a non-replacement calf, and they're considered a byproduct of the dairy industry. And the majority of them at the moment are euthanized, I suppose, at 4 days of age. So in New Zealand, we have upwards of 2 million every year that have no use and are considered essentially a byproduct or a waste product of the industry. So when I was doing bulls, I would go to a dairy farm, pick up these animals essentially at 4 days of age, take them back, rear them by hand, which is how you do it at small scale, and then take these animals through to finishing at approximately 18 months of age. And that was done through intensive grazing, through rotational grazing. And obviously we were measuring everything and making sure the growth rates were there. So I knew how fast these animals grew. I knew there were huge amounts of them that weren't being used for this purpose. And it was pretty heartbreaking, but I also knew that there was a massive opportunity because there was a production system that we could essentially create that would be unique to New Zealand. It would be based around, obviously, grass-fed, based around our grass growth curves, but also creating a ingredient essentially for global manufacturers that was actually in demand, especially with the attributes that we could wrap around it.
So why do you think not very many people tackled this issue before?
Because everyone looks at it in terms of existing systems and structures. So I essentially took a first principles approach of let's break this down completely. Everyone thinks in terms of muscle cuts when they think of meat. But muscle cuts, once you start thinking about it in terms of that, dairy genetics don't really suit that, especially in New Zealand being grass-fed, because they don't necessarily give you the intramuscular fat that consumers want in table steaks. But we also know that grass-fed is essentially got, most people think about grass-fed and think about health. They think about higher omegas, they think about all of these sorts of attributes, not necessarily about eating quality as a steak. But we also know that companies like McDonald's, Costco, Nestle, etc., buy huge amounts of manufacturing beef because they just want to pay for a lean protein. They don't want to pay for the fat. They want to mix their own fats and flavors for their finished products. But they're also the ones making the most noise about reducing the Scope 3 emissions in their supply chains.
Because they're more multinational.
Correct. And I knew for multiple reasons that non-replacement calves, or because they're a byproduct, the majority of their mother's emissions are counted against her milk production, which makes them inherently less emissions intensive from birth. The other thing I knew is that if you look at a feed conversion efficiency curve, which listeners may or may not know what that is, but essentially it's the amount of feed intake an animal has for growth, that at the peak of that feed conversion efficiency curve for these bulls was approximately a year of age. And after that, you've got a whole lot more of their feed intake going towards maintenance. And a simple way to think about it is maintenance is methane. So if you want to reduce emissions, you need to put on weight and less maintenance. So the other really interesting thing about that is, if you think about it, is that fits our grass growth curve in New Zealand. So I thought there was an opportunity to essentially create a new stock class specifically designed for manufacturing. And the way I look at it, which, because we also have a massive lamb industry in New Zealand, is the beef equivalent of lamb. Using these non-replacement calves, a system that can be repeated year in, year out, and that starts to tackle this 4-day-old slaughter issue and gives these animals a life beyond 4 days, but wrapped around everything consumers want, which is the provenance story, making sure that we can show we've got very high animal welfare standards, that these animals, while they are alive, have a great life, that farmers are fairly rewarded, and that we can serve it up in nutritious products that are actually good for people's health. So it was a fairly ambitious sort of goal, and it was built around essentially a platform play of a low-carbon manufacturing ingredient. And so we set about doing the science and building all the data and evidence we needed to start to get the word out that this was possible.
So you started out this venture at the production level, looking at it to see if the model would prove out originally, correct?
Yeah, correct.
Understanding that, right? And today, it's more becoming a platform where other farmers in New Zealand can get into the market that you're promoting and the brand that you're promoting.
So there's obviously a couple of big challenges. The challenge in New Zealand is around processing. So these animals being, let's say, 300 kilos live weight when they're processed, don't suit a full-size beef chain, and also are too big for a sheep chain in New Zealand, which are the two sort of most common processing facilities we have. But in New Zealand, we also have a venison industry, which is essentially idle at the time of the year that we want to be processing our animals. So it actually works fairly well from that perspective. But these companies don't have beef export licenses. They've got venison export licenses. So there's a bit of a bottleneck there. Plus also these chains are essentially set up like a traditional chain to break down an animal muscle cut by muscle cut. Mm-hmm. So the much bigger vision is that there's an opportunity to essentially hot bone straight into bulk grinding packs, and the whole thing essentially with that approach can be automated, which takes massive cost out of the system and allows us to return more to the farmer, because this was designed around making sure this is profitable for farmers. And in the same breath, because of the production system not requiring a winter, we can massively reduce cost for the farmer, but we can also have less impact on the environment. So whether that's nitrate to groundwater for winter crops, or having to use fertilizer, or even just animal welfare issues around animals standing around in mud through that winter period, So we tried to tick all of these different boxes and make sure the system had to work for farmers. That was the most important thing, because without farmer support, what's the point? And then once we knew that farmers were really enthusiastic about this model and they knew that they could make money from this model, we're like, well, how do we package it in order to be able to actually sell it?
Right.
Because, that's the key, right? Like there's got to be an end use case.
Yeah, and that's the part that farmers usually don't like to get involved with, right?
Yeah, but there's...
Traditionally.
But yeah, correct. But it needs to be integrated because obviously we can add value at the downstream end as long as there's that data sharing all the way through, because, that whether it's the environmental footprint or the health and nutrition or the animal welfare, that has to be verifiable. It needs to be fully traceable. We need to be transparent in how we talk about this. So it needs to be vertically integrated all the way through. And
are you building out a data platform with specific key data points along the whole journey of that animal from the initial farm that it came from?
Yeah, so in New Zealand, there's a NAIT system, which is essentially just a national animal identification tag that goes in an animal's ear when it's born. So every animal has to be recorded at birth. Anyone that supplies through us, they have to meet specific standards around animal welfare that we set out, and that's rearing standards, that's feeding standards, and they have to share the data, and it's pretty much just based around growth rates at the moment. So our environmental modelling, or our LCA modelling, is based around growth rates. So if you know the weight of an animal at birth, the weight of an animal at death, and obviously exactly how long it's been alive, you can essentially work out what the average daily weight gain was, but also work out what the carbon footprint was, based on the fact that all of the production systems in New Zealand are essentially the same, being all grass-based. So it's actually, quite simple. So
it makes it a lot more simplified.
Yeah, correct. So essentially every single kilo of output we can attach a carbon footprint for, which is what these large corporate purchasers want, as long as it's fully traceable, fully transparent, and it's got that emissions reduction in it. And the thesis is that they'll pay a few more cents per kilo in order to achieve their emissions reduction goals, which a lot of them have set 2030 for and really don't have a way to achieve it at the moment.
So what were some of the big challenges that you faced outside? I know you mentioned processing as well as potential policy issues that you have run into. What are some of the other big ones that you've really had to hit head on to make this work?
Well, considering that New Zealand is reasonably well known globally as a red meat producer, there's nowhere in New Zealand you can contract, manufacture or co-pack a meat product. Which, in the States, there's huge amounts of options. You'll be familiar yourself with chomps who have gone from strength to strength in a huge company now. And that was all done through co-packing. So in New Zealand, we don't have that option. But I believe the New Zealand branding and the whole story is important to add the value here instead of send the raw material offshore and make it elsewhere, because, you lose a little bit of what we're about. So that's been a big challenge, trying to set up that. So this has been very capital intensive from the start, because there hasn't been the infrastructure just to tap into. We've had to convince venison processors or meat industry that this is a viable option, but this is also disruptive to their business model. And there's a lot of fear within the New Zealand agricultural system amongst traditional beef farmers that this elevates dairy beef and devalues existing beef. So there's a bit of fear, and obviously this is just new, but I just see this as a unique opportunity and some unique IP that New Zealand can offer to the world, because of the scale of our non-replacement calf problem, which is unique globally. It's also a very defensible commodity that we can produce, that we could be known for. Like some countries are known for coffee or spices, we can have this low carbon manufacturing ingredient with all these really positive attributes wrapped around it, which you can only source from New Zealand.
On the farm production side of things, I always look at the life cycle of an animal from a production standpoint and figuring out where do you have to be weight wise in order to on the meat side of the market in order to maximize profit, whether that be per acre, per hectare in your case, or per animal unit. And obviously, when you're raising a young animal, there's a lot of cost up front there. So you're trying to put a lot of weight on the back end to bring down your cost up front, right? So how does that work into this model? Does it pencil out pretty well in the end, even though the carcass weight's much, much smaller than typically what producers would be used to putting out?
So essentially what we did is we went to farmers to find out what do you need to get paid in order for this to work for you. And that's where we started from. So we didn't develop the model and then realize that, we couldn't afford to pay farmers what they needed because, you got nothing if farmers aren't supplying. So farmer returns were the most important, and that's where we started. And that's why we built this, I suppose, this added value use case. And also in New Zealand, because, dairy farmers don't want to be rearing all of these additional animals. They don't have the shed space.
Right.
And there's this other big problem in New Zealand around calf rearing. It's a boom and bust industry where, if commodity prices are high, people will get into calf rearing, but then commodity prices crash and then the next year everyone gets burnt. So there's this massive issue around investing in permanent infrastructure around volume calf rearing, which is a specialist skill and it needs to be done properly. And again, with technology coming along with automated calf rearing and all this sort of the carry on, which allows you to verify that every calf's had what it needs, you avoided some of these animal welfare issues and you can remove some of the staffing issues around it as well. We contract from birth all the way through to finishing. So our model, which we're building out, is essentially like a hybrid co-op model where in New Zealand especially, there's a lot of corporate dairy. Mm-hmm. They have ESG mandates. They don't want to have this bobby calf problem there. So essentially, by them investing in this model, they can then supply. They may not do the rearing themselves. Some of them do because they're large-scale dairy and sheep and beef. But others can then sell those calves for a higher value to a rearer, and then they go into another, they might go into a finisher, which will just be a grass-based finisher. And again, they have to meet certain environmental standards, have, they need to have the audits to show that they're, do the right sort of behaviors, and then they can then supply into our system. So it's traced all the way through. So we're very conscious that calf rearers need to make money and finishers need to make money. But the economics do stack up, especially because we can run 3 of these animals to every full-size 2-year-old with no wintering costs either. So roughly in our system, and this will be a surprise to probably a lot of your listeners, that farmers get in New Zealand for, say, a 4-day-old calf, if they go on a truck to go and be removed from the system, they might only get $40 or $50. We're essentially giving them the opportunity to get paid, say, $150 a head. The calf rearer might get $600 for rearing that to 100 kilos. And then the finisher gets like $1,100 just for feeding it grass for 6 months.
So there are pretty good margins in it through the whole supply chain.
Yeah. And the whole point of this model is that every part of the value chain benefits equally, or at least benefits proportionate to the amount of work they do. And that's why we're trying to build sort of loyalty, make sure it works for everybody, because we're trying to build something for the future that's going to be around, and people want to supply. And that's why everything's contracted as well, because farmers need to know under this model that as long as they hit these weight targets, they'll get these animals off farm, because the last thing we want is winter coming, feed running out, and you can't get rid of an animal. So that's why, the whole thing is planned right from birth to make sure that it works. And also because of the scale of the problem, the scale of the opportunity is massive, especially then, we talked about automated calf feeding, but then you've also got things like halter. You can do rotational grazing at scale and essentially grow these animals the way they need to be grown and fed, without, again, a lot of the labour issues around some of the farm infrastructure issues with fencing. So it completely changes the economics of a sort of a larger scale system, but also the data sharing and availability all the way through. So there's sort of a merging of, technology that enables a system like this with the data at the end that the consumer or the manufacturer is prepared to pay a little bit extra for as well.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Do you see any other technologies besides the example you gave of halter that could really propel this idea forward?
I think that halter as an operating system for agriculture has got so much potential. Like, I think we're just at the very birth of what this is going to be capable of. Once you start to integrate more environmental data, whether it's weather, whether it's it's satellite imagery for even weighing animals, for predictability. There's just so much that this is going to unlock, and I think that data is going to carry so much value, and animal performance is just going to go through the roof, especially with our grass-based production systems.
Yeah.
So halter really, really excites me. Obviously, being an export beef farmer, all we did was daily shifts. I knew how fast the animals grew. I knew also what all the downsides were around labour, and also if the bad weather was coming, you get pugging and you get these issues. So halter is just a big unlock at scale, and it just ticks so many boxes, I think, for the future. And I think it's going to unlock a lot of additional innovation. In lots of other areas as well. So, I'm pretty excited about the convergence of technology and agriculture, and I think we're only sort of at the beginning of what's going to be possible. And then you combine that with food science, because I think everyone in agriculture thinks that what they produce is good for you, but sometimes we've let other people use it in ways that maybe hasn't sold that story, or use it as a part of something else. Whereas I think there's a real opportunity to go back to, all natural ingredients that are functionally designed to be healthy, and we've got the science to prove it, instead of having all these numbers and chemicals and everything else added to our food supply.
Now, going to the food side of things, with the branding of your business, what were I just did an episode on branding, so it's kind of top of mind. What are some of the keys that you said, these are the real messages that we want somebody to get our brand is all about? Like, simple message, what is the brand?
In New Zealand, we've got this thing called a Te Ao Māori worldview, which is essentially that everything is interconnected. And so the brand's sort of built around that messaging, and that's also, the value chain. But it's built from, environmental health to human health. So the brand's sort of built around that and being able to tell that story in the future, potentially because with social media, you can break that story down into lots of different components. And I think that that's sort of where we're at. But the brand's essentially built around human health, functional nutrition, and meat hasn't really played in that space before, apart from protein. So I see red meat as essentially a functional carrier with other natural ingredients to create whatever functional health outcome you might want. And there's ways to design that, again, with technology and AI coming, of what other ingredients could we incorporate in order to get this particular outcome, whether it might be for sports physiology, recovery, for elderly nutrition, for youth nutrition. The world's your oyster. And that's where I'm quite excited to just think of red meat as a functional ingredient, similar to what dairy's done with milk powder. It's everywhere. But red meat hasn't been thought about in those terms before. And that's sort of what excites me. And that's our current version, we've only got one single SKU. Essentially, this is just a demonstration use case for this platform. And we're going to build out functional use cases. And at the moment, we're only available for sale in New Zealand, but this has been designed as a global export product, because we believe what Chomps has done is obviously pretty awesome, but we think that you combine that sort of approach with the other functional attributes we could add to it with the New Zealand provenance and the grass-fed story, that we can build something pretty significant that'll go hopefully a wee bit of a way to solving this non-replacement issue. Right.
So 5 years from now, you've got multinationals on board. You've got your platform going. What does the company look like to you 5 years from now?
Well, it's going to be completely vertically integrated. So we'll own the processing facilities. They'll be based around automation. the farmers will be fairly rewarded and we'll just have huge demand for supply. Like, I don't think supply is going to be our bottleneck. It's going to be the throughput at the other end. But what I really want to do is add value onshore here in New Zealand. Like, we're a country that produces great products, but we export most of it in bulk commodities. I think there's a real opportunity to build these brands in New Zealand. So, New Zealand doesn't have the meat snack brands that the US does, that North America has. There's meat snacks all throughout Asia. We don't have a meat snack culture. But I think there's an opportunity to, and if you think about that from an innovation perspective, South Africa's got biltong, the US has got jerky. There hasn't really been anything new produced for a long time. Like, those have been around for forever. But there's some interesting ways to preserve meat, and science and technology is coming to help there as well. Like, in our particular case, we use honey. Honey's been a natural preservative for forever, but it also has other functional attributes, whether it's health, it's got antimicrobial properties. Obviously, it gives you, heaps of energy. So I, for example, use it when I'm doing endurance events because it's got protein, which stops your muscle wastage post-event, and you've got the energy as well. And when you consume sugar or carbs with protein, it doesn't give you the same sugar hit. You get a nice sort of shallow wave and a long tail as far as your glucose spikes. So I just think there's a whole lot of opportunities like that to start to exploit. So I think we're just at the start of a real opportunity for red meat as far as functional nutrition. So my vision, and it's ambitious from a New Zealand perspective, is to grow a multi-billion-dollar platform from a functional ingredient base, supplying other corporates, but also building this, this functional snack brand that uses this low-carbon manufacturing ingredient as the base. Because our production system has shown, what's the science we've done shows that this is the lowest carbon red meat production system per kilo of beef produced ever published. Which is one thing, and obviously the dairy is a big part of that, and also New Zealand's production system. So we're close to 50% lower than New Zealand's average, which globally is already pretty low compared to the rest of the world. And then because of that, the product that we've created also then, once you tie into it, measuring carbon via nutrition, we actually compete with soy proteins, which animal-based products haven't been able to do in the past. So it sort of opens up a whole new opportunity on how we talk about red meat from that perspective as well.
No, that makes a lot of sense. One question I had for you, have you gotten any pushback as you've been presenting this idea from the dairy industry saying, hey, well, if you're going to claim all of the carbon intensity is on the dairy, and this blows up into something big, how about sharing that, right? Have you got that feedback at all? Where you can really define and say, no, this is very definitive on how we calculate the carbon footprint.
Yeah, so we were Fonterra actually putting cash into the science for us. So Fonterra is the big New Zealand dairy co-op, one of the biggest exporters of milk powder globally. They helped fund the science around the carbon footprint of this because they're obviously very conscious of this non-replacement issue, but also very conscious of this dairy beef advantage when it comes to emissions. So it's all been done properly. It's all been done through ag research in New Zealand. It's all been done to international standards. So it's bulletproof from that perspective. Some people might say that it's, it's accounting tricks. But at the end of the day, a dairy cow produces a huge amount of milk, solids throughout its life. It still gets killed once, so it can be used for meat from that perspective. And then it produces all these calves as well. Whereas a beef cow, she only exists for that calf and then still gets killed once. So just from an emissions perspective, they're just a lot more intensive, and that's nothing, it's not their fault, but essentially it's because of the dual purpose nature of a dairy cow and then its offspring.
Yeah.
Yeah, in New Zealand, we've got this, we can lean into that. In the US, obviously, you got feedlots, which means that you can, you create this intramuscular fat that we can't generally produce here in New Zealand with our grass-fed systems. So it's just a different production system. So this is designed for New Zealand and potentially parts of Australia that are grass-fed, where this is a problem. Globally around the rest of the world, this isn't really a problem. I think globally there's 3 odd million bobby calves. New Zealand and Australia account for 2.4 million of those. So
almost.
So we're massive outliers. So it is a unique problem to our parts of the world.
Have you gotten any pushback in the policy area from government, or are they really on board with it?
Yeah, government's very supportive. Some of the biggest pushbacks from the meat industry, because we're disruptive, that they don't want to know about this. They're not very good at differentiating product that comes through. They just want to. They treat mostly everything as the same. There is some unique cases in New Zealand, whether it's Lumina lamb or you might have, Angus or whatever, but that's just based on genetics. But we already have 53% of our beef in New Zealand already comes out of the dairy herd. It's already got this lower emissions advantage. Huge amounts of it is already sold to companies like McDonald's, but they don't get to clip the ticket on those emission savings, which they're looking for, because there's no traceability, there's no origin that's sort of built into what they're buying. So essentially they just claim the New Zealand emissions average at the moment against their ESG goals. But there's a real opportunity then to differentiate dairy origin beef, especially for this use case, which is just what they call a 90 plus CL, so just chemical lean. So it's just a protein really. You don't really want the fat, and that's what they want to pay for. So yeah, pushback, no. The pushback has been from the meat industry in New Zealand. It's a very traditional industry. A lot of the meat industry in New Zealand was built off the back of sheep and traditional beef farmers. And there's a bit of fear, as I say, that this undervalues those traditional industries. But, as you're probably aware, they've sort of done that to themselves anyway, because, all the co-ops in New Zealand are struggling financially. Alliance is about to be sold, which is the last 100% farmer-owned co-op in New Zealand. We're about to be sold to the Irish. So the model isn't working as it currently sits anyway. And we think there's an opportunity here to create a new model, especially because the existing models are all built on 100-plus-year-old legacy systems.
Yeah. They served their time and haven't really transformed since then.
Yeah, exactly. And I think also just the approach of hot boning straight into bulk grinding packs, it just does simplify the automation. Whereas if you want to break down an animal a traditional way, that's very complicated to automate.
So it takes a lot of labor.
Yeah. So our modelling essentially shows that we can have probably 65% less staff on a beef chain with this model. But obviously, it means that you're only doing this. But the carbon footprint modelling we did was from 10 months to 18 months of age. And in New Zealand, as you're aware, majority of these animals are born in spring, but we also do have some autumn calving. So there is an opportunity to essentially have year-round supply and have probably more smaller modular processing facilities set up. So animals don't have to travel quite so far, and then we can export this globally. At 2 million animals odd makes a lot of beef.
Yeah, that's a lot of beef, even if they're a little bit smaller.
Correct. Yeah. And the interesting thing is the yields off these smaller animals is actually the same percentage-wise as the bigger animals.
Really?
So there's no difference there. So we're averaging about 51% yield, which is the same as you get from a full-size 600-kilo Friesian bull. And obviously, as long as we can speed up the chain and obviously, get the processing efficiency through automation, we can pay more to the farmer because there's a massive cost saving to be made in that processing side of things. And also from our particular product, for example, from every, say, 300 kilo live weight animal, we can produce 1,000 packs. So if you even, you just easy maths, let's say it's $5 wholesale per pack, that's $5,000 an animal. So we were turning something that was a $45 payment, say, to a farmer, into a $5,000 export for New Zealand. And New Zealand needs more of that. We've got these targets to reduce emissions, but also double exports. And the good thing about the system that we've developed, it actually achieves both those.
Right.
Because at scale, we did some modeling around every animal. If every animal was put into the system from 10 to 18 months, we could produce the same amount of beef as we currently produce. We would obviously displace some existing beef animals, but as a country, we'd have a 37% lower beef emissions footprint. And obviously, the country set this 30% target. So the system actually achieves that. But it does require, obviously, large-scale buy-in and cooperation, that this is essentially a single desk type seller model, because the last thing you want is for everyone to start trying to do the same but different, and it just loses what it is. And then they just end up competing against each other, and the whole thing gets lost.
And New Zealand has seen that in the past.
Correct. Yeah, which is crazy, considering that they're all essentially trying to sell the same story.
Right.
But they end up just competing on price.
Yeah.
And Fonterra's done really well with that GDT option by being able to essentially set a price. And if there's something unique from here that all these large corporates want, and they can only buy it from here, and there's never going to be enough to satisfy the demand, like even across 2 million animals, that's still a drop in the bucket for what McDonald's uses globally every year. But they could mix it with their existing beef supply, essentially claim maybe a 20% overall reduction just from that aspect. And it solves our problem, and hopefully makes farmers a bit better off as well.
Yeah. And that was one thing when I was in New Zealand. I did a podcast on that back in February. That really hit me as New Zealand, in my mind, really has to figure out how to transform, adding more value, as you mentioned, to the commodities. You guys are so good at producing commodities, but in the end, in order to get to that next rung up the ladder, you have to figure out how to add value. And I think this is a great example of one way to achieve that. Yeah,
well, and look, I'm lucky, because essentially farmers in New Zealand have built this global reputation over the last 150 years of, food quality, food safety, grass-fed health. And we've even got our fruits and our other things that have also built that story. And essentially I just get to combine it. And just with the consumer trends and the way technology is, there's just stars have aligned for a system like this to be able to be built now. So I think it's pretty exciting, and that's why it frustrates me a little bit where there's a bit of an attitude in New Zealand of what's the next big shiny thing, because it's not agriculture. I think we've spent 150 years building this opportunity, and there's a whole heap of them within agriculture as well. It just requires a bit of out-of-the-box thinking.
Yeah, just disruption, as you said. And speaking of disruption, I guess that's kind of probably where I want to talk for a few minutes before we end here is, what advice would you have to the audience? A lot of people listening to this like to think disruptively or think out of the box, and that's one of the reasons why they listen. So what advice would you give them if they're looking at a new opportunity that's going to be disruptive? What should they be thinking about? What should they be keep their eyes open for, and understanding how hard it's going to be?
Well, definitely stay naive to a degree, because otherwise you never start, right? Like you want to have the idea, have the ambition, and then chase it. So you want to be well read, and you want to have connected all the different dots, because disruption is often just connecting different dots into something that other people haven't seen yet. But also don't go too deep, and don't listen to people that will tell you it won't work. This whole system that I've developed, everyone says you're trying to do too much, focus on the meat snack, but they don't understand that it's this entire play, and I'm just slowly building, and whether or not this works, I hope that it inspires other people within New Zealand or within global agriculture to just think about what we can do, globally moving forward. That's not only good for farmers, because it's important that we retain, family-owned farms, and that they're profitable, and that we are feeding people healthy and nutritious food. And I think we can do all of it by just, I suppose, taking control back of our destiny, but also in in Māori, they've got this whole thing called mokopuna decisions, which is essentially making decisions now that are going to benefit our grandchildren. I think that the Western world's lost a little bit of that focus. We've got quite selfish. We don't really think about the next generations and the generation after that anymore. We're just about how do we make the most amount of money today? And I think that if we start thinking more collectively around what we want, for the next generations, then some really interesting ideas are going to come out. But also it's how you build these collaborations. And we're obviously stronger if we collaborate and we're as a group. And that's also why I'm a bit of a big believer in the possibilities around potential hybrid co-ops, moving forward.
Well, Daniel, thank you so much for being on the AgCulture Podcast today. How can people find out more about Ocean Foods, right?
It's Alps2Ocean Foods. So in New Zealand, we've got the Southern Alps, which runs down the spine of the country, and everything we produce between there, Alps and the ocean. But LinkedIn's where to go. I'm quite active on LinkedIn, and essentially that's how I've started to build the story and get followers. So yeah, Daniel Carson at LinkedIn, or Mīti, Miti, on LinkedIn, and great to connect. I love connecting with people. Love to hear the feedback, and we've had a lot of interest out of North America, potentially even into what our product is and could be. But also there's huge competition over there for the meat snack category. So we might start in Asia and then maybe end up there one day.
There you go. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Daniel. We'll put the information in our show notes as well. So if you're listening, check that out. Check out Daniel's LinkedIn, and thank you so much for being here.
No, I love what you do, and really appreciate having the opportunity to talk.
Thanks, Daniel.
See you.